Charlton. The question is that the motion be agreed to. I give the call to the member for Corangamite.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on this motion put forward by the member for Macon. And I have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, it's disappointing to hear from the member for Macon so many spurious, inflammatory, irresponsible and frankly false claims. I often despair at the way in which politicians are perceived in our community. And I know for myself as a new member, Mr Deputy Speaker, I do try very hard to play a straight bat and to tell it as it is. And I have to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that and I would never say this about members opposite because I know it to be false. So when the member for Macon says that our government doesn't value scientists or researchers, I mean, it's that sort of rhetoric that's just disappointing. It's clearly ridiculous. And more so, it's disappointing because I do think we need to see a higher level of debate. I do agree, Mr Deputy Speaker, with the member for Macon who asserts that there are huge opportunities to create new advanced manufacturing jobs in industries with the right government support for our science, research and manufacturing sectors. We agree wholeheartedly, and that's why we are providing such strong support for these areas. I want to put on the record, Mr Deputy Speaker, in 2014-15, the government is providing $9.2 billion in support of science, research and innovation. Support for science and research in the industry portfolio will total $5.8 billion over 4 years. This includes more than $3 billion for the CSIRO. There are some savings being made at science agencies, just like other government entities. The reality is that members opposite have left us with no alternative. Labor's legacy to the people of Australia was, of course, gross debt projected to rise to $667 billion and $123 billion in cumulative deficits. Mr Deputy Speaker, the efficiency dividend increases from the 1st of July 2014 from 2.25% to 2.5% apply to all agencies subject to the efficiency dividend. It only applies to a percentage of the budget funding for AIMS, CSIRO and ANSTO representing their corporate component. And in addressing some of the false and inflammatory claims that have been made in this debate, I do want to reflect on my own electorate of Corangamite, Mr Deputy Speaker, and look at what happened with Ford. Ford, of course, ended its manufacturing under the previous Labor government, and Labor often forgets to remind the people of Corangamite about that. In January 2012, the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard came to Geelong and announced $34 million for Ford. And then some 6 months later, after promising this would lead to 300 new jobs, we saw a loss of 330 jobs. The fact of the matter is that Holden, Toyota and Ford left of their own volition, and the fact of the matter is that we have had very, very strong support for the auto sector. And if you look at Labor's record, Labor promised $6.2 billion in funding for the auto sector over 13 years, and yet in 2011 reneged on 3 separate programs. The Cash for Clunkers program, wasn't that a great success? It absolutely crashed. The Green Car Innovation Fund, the LPG vehicle scheme to encourage the uptake of LPG. And then to cap it off, we saw from members opposite when they were in government how they slugged the car industry, or attempted to, with $840 million in carbon taxes over a decade and $1.8 billion in FBT changes. So what we are doing is we are confronting the big challenge for jobs of the future, Mr Deputy Speaker. That's why we are rolling out our growth fund, a $155 million growth fund, $30 million for skills and training, a $15 million boost to the automotive industry structural adjustment program, $20 million for the auto diversification program, a $60 million next generation manufacturing investment program. And one of the recipients of a grant under that program is IXL Backwell, just announced in Geelong, a great local manufacturer in Geelong last week. So our government has a very strong support for science, for research, for innovations. We have a strong focus on investing in these industries, building the jobs of the future, and not throwing the Band-Aid solutions, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we saw under the Labor Party. Thank you.
I thank the member for Corangamite.